Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Hugh Robinson. I'm the Exhibition Director for Data Centres Ireland, which unfortunately, due to the pandemic, cannot be held physically this year, but will take place next year on the 16th and 17th of November 2021 at the RDS in Dublin. The Data Centres Ireland Virtual Festival has consisted of a series of live panel discussions held over the course of the week, and have featured industry leaders and experts discussing key areas affecting data centres, from Brexit and grid flexibility to retrofitting and the role of data centres can play in achieving carbon net zero. Today is no different. This is the final festival of the week, and I would like to thank these panellists, Emma, Manuel, Steve and Mark, for their time this afternoon. It's, I think, an extremely interesting subject, which is to do with legislation and standards and what may be coming down the way within the European context. As well as live panel discussions, we also feature a range of on-demand content which can be accessed through the Data Centres Ireland website. This afternoon's webinar, as I say, addresses legislation and standards. And if you would like to ask any of the a question to any of the panelists, please do so through the chat box, and they should be addressed at the end of the discussion. This webinar will be recorded and uploaded to the Data Centres Ireland website as additional on-demand content. The moderator for this afternoon's panel discussion is Steve Phipps, who is a consultant at, I'm going to get this wrong because I didn't write it down, PTS Consulting.
Perfect.
Wonderful. So without listening to any more of me, let me hand you over to Steve, who will start you off on this discussion. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugh. We'll let you pop off now. And I'm absolutely honoured to have joining me on our virtual couch today three very distinguished people who I know. Well, I know two of them very, very well, and I've had the privilege to have a chat with Manuel earlier this week. So I think we're going to have a really fascinating discussion between the four of us. Yeah, I mean the standards landscape, the regulatory landscape, you know, it's a constant moving target, and it's going to be fascinating to see what's going on. Who are the major players, where we think it's going, and who better to take us through that than these three people who are joining me, or to my left, but I'm guessing slightly mixed up for everybody else who's watching the rest of the presentation. But why don't we start with Manuel? Please let us know who you are.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Ireland. I'm Manuel Mateo Goyer. I work in the European Commission in the Cloud and Software Unit, and I'm one of the teams dealing with the greening of data centers, a topic I'll develop later on in the conversation.
Mark?
Yeah, so Mark Acton, I operate as an independent consultant, but I think for the purposes of this panel, I'm involved in a number of standards initiatives. So I'm responsible for editing the European Code of Conduct for data center energy efficiency. I also work on BSI committees, which are national contributing committees which roll up into European and global committees on data center standardization. So I'm involved in the sort of creation and or refining of the EN 5600 standard, as well as the emerging ISO IEC standard, which is the new 22237 standard. And if anybody's interested in talking about those standards and you're feeling fairly sleepless, then do get in touch.
And our final panelist is Emma Fryer from techUK. She's going to also segue straight into a presentation to kind of set the scene for this discussion today. So Emma, please take us away.
Hi, thanks. So I'm Emma Fryer. I look after the UK data centre for techUK. We're a broad-based technology association, and really my job relates to matters of policy reputation and compliance. So I kind of sit between a rock and a hard place, I think, between the sector and everybody else. Anyway, I'm happy to just, I've done some slides to give us really a starting point for the discussion rather than anything else. So here we go. And Kirsten's very kindly going to move them on for me. Okay, so let's move on. So just what I do, most of my work is really either trying to change things that we think will have an adverse impact on the sector and the business environment. I try and mitigate stuff that we can't change. So I've done a lot of trying to simplify compliance requirements, reducing costs, and advocating pragmatism. And we've been, had mixed success with that. But a lot of the stuff I do is really explaining and informing, and that's explaining the sector to policymakers, explaining policy to the sector. There we go. So that's my job. Right, move on swiftly. So why we need policy instruments. And I thought it was worth putting this in because I think sometimes we lose sight of that in the sense that, sometimes we're accused when we discuss things with governments, whether European or nation state, before you ask, the answer's no. And that isn't really the case. And there's a very good reason for having policy. And it's to do with what we call externalities and market failure. And to give you an example, an externality is an adverse effect that impacts somebody because there is no natural sort of correcting activity in the market. So for instance, if you were a tanner and you tanned leather in a river and you poured all your tanning waste into the river, if someone else downstream is a fisherman and it kills all the fish, they're going to be out of work. But you're not going to stop tanning stuff in the river because it doesn't affect you, doesn't cost you anything, saves you money to do it. That's when you need policy and regulation to try and intervene on externalities like pollution. I'm not sure I explained that very well, but hopefully you get the gist. And so what they do is they intervene in those markets, and that's really what policy instruments are for. And there are two types of policy instrument generally. I'm being simplistic here: command and control or economic. So if you can move me on, Kirsten. So here we are. So command and control sets out thou shalt not do this, or thou shalt only do this to a certain limit, or thou could only do this in a certain way. The disadvantage of that is it can be inflexible, takes a long time, and then it gets outdated as people move on. The other kind is an economic instrument, which are taxation incentives, and that's what we call polluter pay. So if you want to pollute, you jolly well pay the tax. The disadvantage of that is you can choose to pay, and in affluent societies, polluter pays taxation doesn't always work because if the people who are if people are wealthy and don't care, they'll pay and feel they then have a right to pollute. So there are pros and cons with both these, but actually economic instruments do tend to be more flexible. The EU ETS is a classic economic instrument, but to which also a cap is being applied. So you kind of have both of those working at the same time. Okay, do you want to move me on, Kirsten? So where we are now. And this is quite fun for me because I tend to keep a much closer eye on UK legislation, and there's plenty of that coming down the pipeline. But it's really interesting to look more broadly at the European. So we had the new Parliament and the new Commission last year. Work programmes well underway, very ambitious, better coordinated, and very clearly focused on digital. Next slide, please. And these are, I think, one of the reasons it's better coordinated is because of the appointment of EVPs, executive vice presidents, and they have a broader remit across a number of directorates. And that means that rather than directorates working sort of in solos on things, there's much more coordination, which I think will mean we have much better coordinated policy in future. Now, other people on the call may choose to correct me on that, but anyway, let's move on. Next slide, please. Okay, so just quickly to explain, Margrethe Vestager deals with digital, the Commission work plan, and she's got a very good track record in terms of enforcing competition. And now her remit is really to make Europe fit for the digital age. And it's a very ambitious remit. Next slide, please. Just for example, Gaia X, a federated data infrastructure, is one of the big projects that's being planned. And although from our perspective we might see there are challenges, there's certainly no lack of ambition within that kind of activity. So that's one example that I think might form base of discussion later on. I think in the call. Right, we'll move on and we'll talk about environment next. Yes, so environment is led by Frans Timmermans. And that is being delivered through the European Green Deal, again, extremely ambitious. And I think it's important to realise just the level of political will behind that. So it's been endorsed by the Commission, it's been endorsed by the European Parliament, and I believe, and again, I can be probably corrected if I'm wrong, I think there was actually a call for more ambition. So from the Parliament. So that signals that there is, there's real, there's what we call full top-level leadership involved in this. And the priorities include things like Europe being climate neutral by 2050, energy taxation, adapting to climate change, circular economy, and eco-design, the kind of things we'll have heard in terms of the instruments that we've already seen, that we know and love in the regulatory landscape. Next slide, please, Kirsten. And this is just a very quick slide that you can get off the EU website that explains the objectives of the Green Deal in more detail. I'm not going to go through that because that's readily available, but it's just very clearly set out. It's very broad reaching from agriculture, but digital is very much in focus on this. So it's certainly not just about transport and agriculture, not by a long way. Next slide, please. And then I've listed here a bunch of things within the action plan, which I think are probably within the action plan for 2020. It's a very big and ambitious action plan, and stuff is moving pretty fast. So and that's just a list of examples. So I'm not going to run through those, but just really showing you that the objectives of the Green Deal are rapidly being translated, not just into commitments, but into actually specific actions. And that work is going. I've put a URL at the bottom, and I'm assuming that the slides will be made available. I think they're already available, aren't they? Okay, next slide. Okay, and then there's some quite interesting work on the Commission's website, if you have a look, about how the two activities intersect. So not only is there greater coordination within the three executive vice presidencies for those directorates that they look after, but also between them. So there's been a lot of thinking in how the digital strategy and the Green Deal will intersect. And I've sort of extracted from that a few points that I thought are interesting. So boosting, mainly because they affect tech, so boosting the EU's ability to predict and manage environmental disasters, that has an implication for technology solutions. The three that are highlighted in yellow are things that I think will result in more regulation or changes to existing regulation. And then further down, taking advantage of 5G, AI, IoT, edge and cloud, and supporting automated and connected transport. Again, those three, I think, have an implication for obviously the technology sector contributing. So it's you can see classically here the sort of double-edged sword of regulation and scrutiny, but more dependence on technology as well to deliver those outcomes. Next slide. Okay, so this is kind of where we end up thinking about, and I tend to represent the operator perspective, so I'm thinking, well, what does this mean for our operators, data center companies, cloud service providers? So we think we're going to see some new forms of policy intervention. We think we're going to see existing regulations reviewed and revised. And what we're wondering is whether we're going to see more emphasis on industry standards in regulatory instruments. So those are three things, and perhaps we might come back to this slide in terms of questions later, but those are three questions that I'd like to bat round with the other panelists. And then I've got a few other thoughts where I just want to really put some slides out to generate thinking. So Kirsten, if you'd like to move on again. Right, so this is always I'm always whinging about the amount of regulation that we are obliged under. And I think there's an issue for data center operators because the sector is very complex. So it means that we get the regulation for data, we get the regulation for comms, we get the regulation for heating and cooling systems, we get regulation for generators. So because all these different technologies are sort of coordinated within one facility, we do tend to get it in the neck on regulation. And some of those regulations were developed by policy teams that didn't realise data centres existed. And there's a few on there, candidates, where we've actually talked to the policy team and they've said, oh, right, okay, heat networks regulation. Yeah, we didn't really realise you were there. It doesn't really apply to you. So we'll see what we can do. So there are things like that. And there are things where we're much more firmly in the sight the target. So I always do this just to remind operators of this plethora of regulatory instruments. And I used to manage to get this onto one side of A4, and now I'm afraid I can't. It's gone over onto two sides. Anyway, if you'd like to move on, my other thought I wanted to leave is just, are we always doing the right things? There's a huge focus on efficiency improvements. And we know this doesn't always solve the problem. So this is Jevons and Jevons paradox. So that as you reduce the price of a commodity, the demand may increase, and it may well increase far beyond. So here you've reduced the price by just over a third, but the demand has doubled. And that happened with, was it coal in 1865? I think it was, for those of you who are good on Jevons. And if we move to the next slide, I'll kind of explain why this happens. And this is because some activities and commodities are price elastic and some are not. So I always use coffins as a price inelastic commodity, and it sounds rather tongue-in-cheek, but I am not expecting to use or make use of more than one coffin. And if coffins become a lot cheaper, I'm not going to go and buy 10 coffins. Whereas for a price elastic commodity, your consumption increases. So flying has increased partly because it's got a lot cheaper. Communications is hugely price elastic. So the cheaper it becomes, the more we do it. And the more, because a lot of communications is tied up with energy, the more efficient we make it, the cheaper it makes it, the more we do it. So are we kind of doing the wrong thing well, is my question there. So that's another one I wanted to leave with the panel. And then the final question, if we can move down, was just really about standards. And I put a couple of background slides up here just in terms of how can standards help? Why are they useful? You know, and I put a list here in terms of, you know, what they do for companies. And I think if we need to, we'll come back to these slides. So they're more reference slides for discussion. And again, it's one of those things where I think the data center sector is exceptional in the quality, breadth and applicability of its own peer-reviewed industry standards. For an immature sector, it's spectacularly well advanced in standards development. And I think we should be taking, you know, making better use of those standards. And here I'm really trying to say, why aren't we planning to do that? If you just go down to the next slide, Kirsten, I think it's a couple just in terms of, so some of the issues I think people have raised have been things like the complexity of that landscape. But actually, you can map that landscape quite easily. And I have done that. I meant to include the map, but then I realized it was 2 years out of date and I didn't dare because I thought Mark would have me shot.
Not at all.
Because it changes quite quickly. You know, the standards development is quite quick. And just in terms of how the different standards develop, what is a standard? Some things are not standards, but they say they're standards. So we have all that kind of mixed up. Last slide, Kirsten. So the next one. Right. And then just in terms of remembering what makes a good metric, and I think the thought I want to leave here for the panel is that there are lots of things that make a good metric, widely applicable, easy to measure, can be used to compare facilities, can be used to benchmark facilities over time. And hopefully the application of that metric will eventually be governed by a standard. And I have seen people use metrics that give them things that are easy to measure as opposed to things that are useful. So I think the final point is just what you measure must be useful, because if it isn't useful, it's just easy to measure, then there's no point in it. So I think that's what I'm going to leave you with, you know, what makes a good metric. The last slide is just my signature. You can go down to that for the moment, holding slide. But I'm going to hand over to the rest of the panel to see whether anyone's got any comments on some of the things I've planted.
See where it takes us.
Well, thank you very much, Emma. I mean, that was quite a fast scoot through the regulatory landscape. And we are, you know, privileged to have Manuel join us today. So, Manuel, from the kind of Commission perspective, you know, what do you see as the priorities within the data center sector?
So thanks a lot, Stephen. And Emma, if you're looking for a job, I think I could recruit you, because you seem to have presented our policies extremely well. So So become my friend on LinkedIn, and we'll see. More seriously, I think there's from the slides. There's a couple of remarks that I think are extremely relevant for today. The first one is I think it's the relationship in between digital and the environment, and as we presented in the different strategies that Emma just presented, it's a bit of a two-way relationship there. And we believe that the green revolution is only possible thanks to an increased use of digital technologies. The ideas of smart autonomous self-driving cars, of smart grids, of smart communities, all those things are only possible if you have much more pervasive digital than even today. And it's not only about data centers, it's about connectivity in general, it's about broadband, it's about fiber, it's about 5G, and so on and so on and so on.
Yeah.
And so the net effect, and this is our working assumption, the net effect is that digital contributes more to green than it causes a problem. So an increase of digital is a net positive for environment. This doesn't mean that digital is exempt of problems, and I'm getting there now. So we believe that at the same time, the digital sector should do its own part at becoming greener and improving itself. And this is where I think there's at least two relevant segmentations. The first one is that, so today we're talking about data centers, but there's other parts that are equally, that have an equal environmental footprint that need to be looked at. I'm thinking about communication networks, but I'm thinking as well about our little devices and the many more of those which need to be looked at. And I think this is where I always get confused with the term externality, so I'll try to avoid it. But I think this is where data centers somehow are a little bit different than other areas of this green and digital discussion, in the sense that there's a natural incentive for data center operators, and no matter if you're a bare metal or a service, software as a service, or whichever type of provider, you always have an interest that your electricity bill is lower, right? Mm-hmm. And so you always have such an interest, and it's not the case in many environmental areas. If you operate a logistic company and one of your trucks has got a default exhaust pipe, it's a cost for you, and it's cheaper for you to keep the lorry running on the roads with a default exhaust tube. It's not the case in the data center world. The other thing is that I think data centers are probably among the low-hanging fruit. They're extremely complicated to operate, and you know much more than me. But we're still talking about a limited number of market players, of operators, compared to the hundreds of millions of electronic devices around us. And don't get me on the sensors and actuators of the Internet of Things and things like this. Green data centers are still fairly big things that you can see with your own eyes, and you could even have an inventory, and we could discuss about this. Now, when looking at really now the data centers, I think there's a part that we always discuss, which is the energy and the energy efficiency part, but we very often tend to forget what my colleagues call the embedded energy. the energy that got the data center to work. So the sustainability part, all the material, all the extraction of the material and the production of the chip and the servers and the storage and the cooling equipment and so on that got into the data center. And that part is often forgotten. And it's as well, I think, a part which needs to be looked at. And when I hear very often some practices such as, we're just shredding a 1-year-old hard drives because our client paid for it, and that's the best way of securely decommissioning it. I tend to believe we can collectively do better in handling those parts, and this is, one of the places where I think we can do much better. And then, when we now look I'm trying to get more and more narrow. When we get into the energy efficiency, really, of the data centers, I think, Emma, you pointed out to quite a few of the things we see as well as you do, and I think pretty much any professional. What is the role of standards? What is the role of metrics? I haven't been working in this area for too long time, but I haven't seen anyone telling me, metrics are working all right, we're all on the same page. All those features that one of your last slides, Emma, was presenting, can we compare performance of data centers? Can we look at them throughout time? Is it auditable? Can this audit be reproduced, and so on and so on? I haven't seen heard a professional telling me this without a big blink in the eye. So those are just a few considerations. Sorry, and then I think in one of your very early slides, you have 3 questions on things that we might be doing or not. And I think one of the things, so to give an easy answer, to answer the easy of the 3 questions, which is some legislation being reviewed? The answer is yes. Those reviews have been announced. I can dig into the details and what they imply and what are the ideas on the table. But the Energy Efficiency Directive is under review. The Eco-Design Directive on server products and storage units, whatever it's called, is under review. We have freshly adopted green public procurement criteria for the public sector, where there's now a question mark whether to make them mandatory for public procurers. There's a initiative on green claims on the table. There's the taxonomy regulation, which is now enforced, but the details of its implementation is now up for public consultation since this afternoon. So if there's a way of sharing the link, I'll put it through there in the chat box. And there's probably 1 or 2 that I forget, but this is a quick overview of some of the things that are going on at the moment. Maybe not the last ones, but certainly things that are happening as I speak.
Thanks, Manuel. Mark, there's been fantastic recognition, from both Emma and Manuel about what we're doing as an industry around, getting ourselves in order. I mean, we've been doing the energy efficiency really since 2007, 2008, and the EU Code of Conduct for data centers is a fantastic EC-led initiative that has been adopted throughout the world. So why is it we still seem to be the target of regulatory interest, shall we say, from the EC? Why are we not convincing people that we can actually do this ourselves?
It's a good question, to be honest, Steve. It's a very good question. I think there's probably several reasons. One, I think the biggest challenge we have in our industry is actually demonstrating energy efficiency. If you're making steel, it's very easy because you say, I can consume this many watts and I will get this much steel out of it. And to produce a ton of steel, I can reduce the number of watts required, and therefore I become more efficient. I think within our sector and the digital sector generally, this isn't just about data centers necessarily. It's very, very hard for us to define efficiency, because from a physics perspective, efficiency is defined as useful work done, and we do not have the ability to define useful work. Mm-hmm. Different people have different opinions of what useful work is, and that's pure physics. Energy for useful work done, that's physics. So what we do, we have all sorts of proxies, we have all sorts of things that attempt to break that down. But the reality is we don't have a true efficiency metric. We don't have anything that we can actually pin to and say, if we apply this metric and we reduce this number, we will de facto become more efficient. We just don't have that. So I think what we tend to get, and particularly through the media, is lots and lots of large companies, large buildings, which consume vast amounts of power, let's be honest, vast amounts of electricity. We effectively are putting a big target on those buildings, saying, yeah, here I am, I'm a building, I'm consuming, or a series of buildings, I'm consuming 100 megawatts of power. What do I usefully produce out of that? Very, very difficult to define that. So that is one area of problem. Yes, we all accept there are benefits. There are probably social benefits. There are commercial benefits. I mean, particularly in times of COVID, our society would probably have broken down in many respects if we had not had the communications capability that we currently have. So, there are all sorts of benefits, but very, very difficult to measure the value of those benefits. And again, I think the second thing is, because we don't have a true efficiency metric, it's very difficult for us to defend ourselves and actually say genuinely we are getting better. So we have this thing called PUE, which everybody references. Not many people really understand, but we do have this thing. People often use it as a proxy for energy efficiency. But even if it is a proxy for energy efficiency, which is a bit of a debate anyway, it's not true efficiency. It only covers certain aspects. It covers the building elements of a data center. It doesn't begin to approach the IT elements. So, we are not in any way referencing the IT component, which actually is ultimately the consumer of the power. The building doesn't really consume power. The building imposes an overhead on top of the IT, which consumes power. So that's really what PUE is measuring. So we're not really, even though we've got all sorts of initiatives around PUE, we're not really attacking the problem. We're not dealing with the problem at all. So which is why it's difficult. And again, we have a number of other KPIs and metrics out there. The only one we seem to reference is PUE, which actually is a disappointment, because there are others out there which we probably should be using, but nobody's actually aware of. And that's within the industry, but actually also beyond it. So I think there's no single answer to your question. There's probably a number of reasons in there, a few of which I've hopefully covered.
Thanks, Mark. Emma,
but there are more.
Emma, what Mark's saying, really, doesn't that present a bit of a problem for you when you're kind of going out and talking to the lawmakers, shall we say, and trying to convince them that actually the industry is doing okay, it's progressing, it's getting better. I mean, where do you even start if the people in the industry don't even understand the metrics that they're talking about? How on earth do you get somebody who's not in the industry to understand?
Yeah, that's why I say I live between a rock and a hard place. So yes and no, but I mean the problem is with us is the answer to most questions people ask me is it depends, because it does depend, because it's not, you can't attribute a certain amount of trying to attribute a certain amount of carbon to a piece of steel produced is complex in its own right, but relatively simple compared to trying to say, how much energy does 1 hour of Zoom take? And we've probably seen the last week there's some very, very strong opinions in very different areas on that one. And the funniest one I saw was that if you were saying it would use a kilowatt hour of power to be on Zoom for now, and actually it was better to drive if you're going to Zoom. And I think it's only better to go to to travel to a Zoom meeting if you walk, if you cycle, or if you are a pigeon. Those are the only three.
Okay.
Where it's generally better. Anyway, so even us, we spend hours arguing about how many angels can fit on the head of a pin. So my feeling is that we have to move outside that and be a bit more, look at the data in a slightly meta way. Firstly, you have to keep a really close eye on what's going on top line. So everybody's been telling me for 2 decades that we're all going to have to go and live in caves and eat bugs because data centers are going to use up all our power. At the same time, and everyone's saying, oh, you know, thousands of data centers in the UK. There aren't, you know, there's hundreds and lots of horrible server rooms and things, but and that it's a catastrophe, and we're using, you know, 300 terawatt hours. Well, we're not. We're using 3 terawatt hours in the commercial part of the sector. We're doing an awful lot more in terms of productivity for that, and that's the thing we've got to keep an eye on, is the carbon productivity. But the, you know, what's interesting is if you actually look at the top line figures, and this is really important in the UK, our electricity use has decreased year on year since 1992. And it's pretty stable. It's around the 300, 330 terawatt hours. And therefore, you can't, you know, if someone's saying, well, sorry, data centers are adding 50% to our electricity use, they're not, because they can't be, because there's too much other stuff in the economy using up the rest of it. You know, so just keep an eye on the top line figures. Regarding the standards landscapes, I said I will post the links into the chat, but everyone, I'm just worried that Mark will shoot me because they're out of date.
No.
We did.
They do change.
I know they do change
slowly.
But I also did a thing called data center metrics for tiny tots, which explains some of the difficulties in doing this and trying to attribute. You know, you can't do a bit per watt thing. You can't do, because the data centers do different things, and you know there's a vast difference between a high performance computing and then a browsing website. Really different. And so, and then you've got this ethical problem: is what is a useful thing? Is it a good thing that people spend a lot of time uploading videos of themselves teaching their dogs to tap dance? Is that a bad thing? Is it a bad thing? You know, during the last 6 months, you could have said, well, what, you know, why should we let 12 octogenarians clog up the airways talking about Jane Austen for 3 hours? But that Zoom has been a lifeline for people like my mum, who do sit for 3 hours talking to other octogenarians about Jane Austen. So, you know, those things are really, it's so difficult to weigh up those arguments. And I stood back a bit and looked at the map of standards. And then I think we see some gaps. So you see loads of standards and metrics for data center design and build. You see loads for operation. You see almost none for disposal. So firstly, there's a gap there. There's a gap of standards and metrics in the disposal area, you know, end of life. Then the second one is if you go inside the data center, you see loads for data center hardware. You see loads for network. You see loads for comms. Software. So I think we should look at those gaps. Where are we missing those standards? And yes, I think we'll always have to have a patchwork. I think the other thing is I'd warn against trying to search for, like, you know, what is it, the ring to control all rings? What's it called?
The one ring.
The one ring. The one metric is going to be either incredibly difficult to calculate and incredibly expensive to use and impractical. I think it's a nirvana that we're not there. So at the moment we have to use this patchwork of other metrics. I think I've probably talked enough now, so I'm back to you.
Well, I mean, that kind of brings us on back to Manuel, I guess, you know, because there's as Emma was describing, and as you've alluded to, there's a huge amount going on within the Commission at the moment, you know, looking at all this. So where you may not know the answer to this directly, but I mean, where's all the evidence coming from to guide what the Commission's doing?
So that's a very good question, and incidentally, we published last week our most recent study giving us energy projections for the consumption of data centers for the 10 years to come. And it does more than that. So it's, I mean, I think the flagship part of the study is about that. But then there's a number of considerations on policy options and things like this. And there I, you know, linking a little bit to what I was saying earlier, but answering now your question, where does the data come? It comes from projection of, I mean, it is extrapolated on the basis of projection of sales of servers and network equipments and chipsets, etc. It doesn't come from a study of the of the market, because that's typically much more secret. It's less foreseeable. And so when conducting those studies, there's a lot of uncertainty as to how many servers. I mean, where will the servers be used and in which condition? Will it be at an hyperscale site, or will it be in my basement? And so, consultants do estimates and projections and preliminary studies like the ones of the yearly network projection by Cisco is extremely interesting in that respect, and all this. But it often fails to capture the complexity of the system. The other way around is that quite a few studies look the other way around. So they start from the macro and they look at the electricity bill of data centers. But then we get back into what Mark was saying a moment ago, is that PUE is a terrible indicator in many respects. And when you look at the energy bill of the data center, you're looking as well typically at the energy bill of the offices that are next to it, and many other things. And so the two typical ways of evaluating data center consumption, one is underestimating the consumption, and the other is overestimating. And I saw quite recently a comparison of the two, and the figures are quite off on both respects. The range to which it leads is quite broad and makes it difficult. And to me, my biggest surprise, because I quite often participate in one of those talks, and I'm dreaming that one day in the panelists there's the CFO, the chief financial officer of a big data center operator, because I'm quite astonished that the guys who are looking really at the money side are not able to force the engineers to. I don't care if it's perfect or not, but please agree among yourselves, because we need to make investment decisions. And this is a market where, as you know very well, there's mergers, acquisitions, spin-offs, new greenfield projects every day, and so on and so on, and new investment decisions made every day. And I'm very surprised that among CFOs, there's not at least a gentleman agreement on how those things should be calculated.
Yeah, I think when you start to talk about the commercial market, they tend to put a lot of store in what they think their clients want, and will implement that which they believe to be relevant to the market, regardless of the energy efficiency aspects of it. I've seen some awful practices out there, as I'm sure Mark has. As well, where you kind of question, why they've done that, but then they point you to the contracts and the engagement they have with their clients, and they say, well, that's because this client's paying for it, and they don't seem to care. Isn't it difficult to try and encourage best practice and standards in an industry where, to a large extent, the consumers aren't really paying a lot of the bills? Yeah. So the people who are consuming the content and the data of the internet that are coming out of these data centers, they're not paying. It's the Facebooks, the Googles, the Microsofts. They're the people who are actually, paying the bills. Mark.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, well, I think you've got two things going on, haven't you? You've got, to Manuel's point, you've probably got two different sets of CFOs in the data center world. You've got those CFOs that own data centers, essentially. They're at the enterprise data centers where they've got their own estate, where they're actually managing the building and the IT load themselves. And those guys, you're absolutely right. They have a monumental vested interest in reducing the overheads. Which, principally is going to be electricity. So you're absolutely right. I do think, though, many times that the CFOs don't really have the sort of granularity or the visibility of some of the bills, and they don't necessarily understand what's going on there. And I think, we have this sort of within the enterprise data center, still this sort of slightly siloed mentality between the building guys and the IT guys, and the two aren't necessarily in sync, and they don't necessarily talk to each other and decide on, you know, implementing best practice and what could be done. So I think there is a challenge there, and that's, I think, largely about education, because it should be a no-brainer. I also think there's an ROI in there. So yes, is it possible to save money? Yes, it is, but sometimes that involves quite considerable cost, and it's a capital cost rather than an OPEX cost. And so, you know, the finance guys are, you know, beating themselves up about whether they're capital intensive business or an OPEX intensive business. And so, while it might make perfect sense financially to those of us on the street, to, you know, particular businesses, it may make less sense. Then I think you've got the challenge with the co-location guys, which I think Steve alluded to, where, you know, their customers are paying the bills anyway. You know, the colo guys don't necessarily pay the bills. The customers are, so the bills are being passed through. But to defend the co-location operators, you know, they have relatively limited ability to manage their customers and the practices that their customers are using. They will certainly attempt to encourage best practice, and it's certainly in their interest to reduce energy overhead, because of course that makes them more attractive to their customers, and they will all attempt to do that with a great deal of effort, I'm sure. But, you know, their true ability to influence is limited. And again, I think this comes back to education. The problem is, I think, in that particular case, is that a lot of the IT guys do not see the energy bills. You know, they don't understand the true cost of their the systems that they operate and use to deliver their services. You know, if they did, I think Emma's point about software efficiency, you know, we relatively hear about software efficiency, but if we started at the top and the software were more efficient, we'd probably need less hardware and smaller buildings to put it in. So, you know, maybe it should start with hardware. So I think, you know, the CFOs definitely have a role to play, but I think there's different types of CFOs, and their visibility and ability to influence is actually quite limited in many respects.
So we have a kind of regulatory and standard environment that's aimed pretty much at the enterprise, the industry sector, you know, the colos, etc., the commercial data centers, and yet there's also, but we've seen recently, I mean, in the last week, there was what Emma was alluding to. There was a program on in the UK on Channel 4 Dispatches, which actually tried to educate the consumers, the people who are using this technology, about their impact on planet Earth when they use digital services. But it's, I'm just wondering, from an EC perspective, how are you reaching out to those people? Are you trying to do it indirectly by kind of going after the content providers, or at what point do we have to then target the people who are using this technology to let them know that they have a part to play? Manuel.
Oh, I thought the question was for Emma, but
I don't mind starting.
He threw you a dummy there. Yeah.
I don't mind starting if you want to time to think. Or you
no, the question sounded indeed for me. You know, I think, I mean, how to go to the software part is not tremendously. I mean, how to write a piece of legislation or whatever, or softer measures targeting this part of the business is not in itself something addressed to them is not tremendously difficult. We have plenty of legislation that addresses them. I mean, think about GDPR to start with, but there's my team handles the free flow of non-personal data regulation, and I mean, there's plenty of examples out there. So it's not very complicated. The complicated part is to go back to the standards that we've already discussed and so on. But I think, you know, I think there's a principle that doesn't require any type of legislation, which is a principle of call it data frugality. I think the French call it like this, or data minimization. You know, how is it possible that there's streams that are streaming 4K streams to devices that are only full HD?
It's true.
That doesn't make sense. The French Senate is currently debating a bill at prohibiting the autoplay feature at the end of movie playing. So I don't know how relevant or how significant this is, but this is another angle. Whenever I try to, you know, from my lock screen, the software offers me, whenever I've got an email, it offers me the possibility of opening it or archiving it, but not deleting. To delete, I need to open it and then go and look for the icon and delete it. Guess what? I do like everyone. I just archive or I just archive it. I take 10 pictures of Emma's dog. You referred to it earlier. Our beautiful platforms, what they offer me is, I've taken 10, they offer me an 11th one, which is a collage, and then a video, a 12th one, which is an animated thing. Instead of telling me with the same AI feature of telling me, listen, you've taken 10. We think this one is the best. Are you okay that we get rid once and forever of the 9 others? And that they don't do at the moment. And you see, I think at some point there's a thing, you can always legislate on those things, but I think there's as well a bit of common sense that needs to apply, and an idea of software energy efficiency by design that can do already a lot today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more, actually. And I think there's this thing that we'd like to see, I think, in terms of the responsible digital citizen. I think it's the same as your French term, but it's a sense of, and a lot of that is reliant on us as a sector doing a better job of making consumers aware of the energy impact of their online activity. And I think I think the programme earlier this week squandered that opportunity, because actually in some ways it made it more complex because it mixed stuff up. But it did make a couple of very good points. You know, in terms of, you know, actually it's much better to stream over Wi-Fi than it is over mobile phones, you know, made a bit more. And also they did make the HD point, which is good. But I think this is where you have a clash of business model. So we have in the industry a preponderance of advertorial and freemium business models. And they are fantastic for innovation. They've driven the most incredible speed of innovation because you can innovate at much lower risk. You can test stuff in a different way. The problem with those is they don't send any signal to the user of that carbon impact. There's no price signals, no market signals, anything else. And I know there's a lot of discussion in the industry about how you can send that signal. But actually the things you suggest, stop having the autoplay and I actually have not yet managed to work out how I can listen to something on YouTube without watching the video. I know you can, but I haven't quite worked out how to do it. So those kind of things be really, really helpful, and that's why it's happened that way. But there is there's kind of a social contract, I think, that we haven't really bottomed out. I've also posted in the chat a piece we did last year about attributing carbon to outsourced cloud services, and that was more to do with business who were asking for more transparency. But so it's a big conversation. I've got two other small things just to add to that. One was relating to, we were talking about the capital and the talking to the financial FCOs, what are they called? CFO, that guy. And actually what was really interesting is it echoes what Mark said, that when we looked at risks to resilience in the sector, the government that we were talking to was saying, well, obviously the risks are about supply chain and COVID. And we're saying, well, actually, no, the risks are to do with skills and availability of investment capital to upgrade our older facilities. So that sort of maybe speaks volume. The other thing is, it's interesting about what we've discovered from the climate change agreement in terms of the barriers of implementing efficiency improvements at scale within facilities that are running is that you can't, it's not like a motorway, you can't cone off 3 lanes or shut a stretch of railway track. This is like changing the engines in an aeroplane in flight, you know, because there's so little you can do in terms of sort of clearing stuff to do major projects, and that makes it very difficult and very expensive. And also there are certain things that are, and Mark would, you know, and Steve will know more about this than me, but there are certain customer requirements. So customers will have service level agreements that may not actually allow you to run the operation as efficiently as it could be run. And those things can't really be, you know, you might have, you know, 100 different customers in your data center. If one of them says, no, I want my service to run between 18 and 22 degrees centigrade, well, everyone else is kind of lumped in. So those are, and we've been looking at some of those barriers in the climate change agreement. So if you want any more insight into those, I can always drop that across.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I mean I did some witness IST for a large bank's data hall in a very, very well run facility that has, you know, all the usual contractual agreements about how, you know, they're going to pass through the energy cost times the PUE of the facility, you know, of the data hall that the customer's actually inhabiting. And then I went back a year later, and the customer still hadn't put containment in. So, you know, and these people are well educated data center managers, you know, in these organizations, and they're still not doing the right thing. So you can lead a horse to water, but yeah, it is boggling that even they're costing their own company, their own organization, you know, tens of thousands of pounds extra a year and still not doing the right thing.
Different budget, somebody else's budget.
But I also think it depends on your overall turnover. So if you're a co-location operator, you would put those things in because energy is such a large proportion of your corporate turnover. If you're a bank, the energy of your data center is probably less than 0.5% of your corporate turnover, isn't it? So therefore, I wish that person in the data center would stop whinging about all these things he needs doing. It's immaterial to our. So you can see those discussions happening in a company where the data center is merely supporting the IT function of the business, and really they're not that interested in efficiency. They're interested in it working and not falling over, because actually the losses that they would sustain if anyone messed around with it would be so significant. So I think that's that's in itself a barrier which you see perhaps more in enterprise than you do in colo. But I do think it's the case.
Dare I say, though, we're in danger of doing what we always do in the data center sector, which is to kind of focus back on the building and the cooling and the power delivery. And you know, I would suggest that if we actually made better decisions on the IT side, we'd reduce their overall, you know, reduce the overall burden. And I think that's where the low-hanging fruit really is. You know, we're getting to a point of diminishing returns in terms of what we can do in terms of the building overhead, the cooling, etc. I'm not suggesting everybody's doing it, but we know what to do and how to do it. The challenge is absolutely on the IT side, and that is getting better. We are doing more for less energy consumption, as you said, Em, and that's absolutely true. But I still think we can do better. You know, I think we can have less redundancy on the IT side. We can have less equipment. That equipment can be utilized more effectively. So I think there's a great deal to do, and you know, that's without even going towards the software that the applications use. So I think that's the area to go to, in my view.
Mark, that's a fascinating point. And you know, Emma, you were talking about, you know, the dearth of kind of standards around the software side of energy efficiency, whereas the infrastructural side and the hardware side seems to have continued apace for the last, you know, 13, 14 years. Now, I don't think that's particularly a surprise to people like Mark and I when we sit in these best practice or standards meetings and we look around and pretty much everyone in the room is an engineer.
Yeah. It's true.
You know,
it's true.
And so you think, well, that's why we're talking about the facility. That's why we're talking about the hardware, because, you know, we haven't got any software people here apart from us. You know, and then when they do start talking about software, it's usually so nonsensical. They just don't understand it that you can see why it doesn't go anywhere.
I'm going to make a slight correction, actually, Steve. You're absolutely right. I am an engineer, and I'm even a chartered engineer, but I got it on the IT side, not the building side. So
no, that's what I'm saying. You and I.
But
you're
so
probably one of the two people who actually understand IT as well as the hardware. But I mean, there was a vested interest for the hardware guys. You know, they wanted to compete to have the most efficient cooling system. You know, and they're desperate to sell more units. And you know, why wouldn't they want to get involved in that? Because it makes them look good. But the software side is just so disparate. There's so many different people involved and all different layers and levels. It's very difficult to bring them together. So how, from a regulatory perspective, Manuel, how do we reach out to the software side? How do we bring them into the?
Well, you know, I think the challenge is not unique to this policy area. It happens in any policy area where, you know, you have different camps and they speak among them, and it's always the other's fault. So I'm sure if today was a software panel, they would say, "Oh, but you know, get diesel-powered data centers. That doesn't work."
It's a very good point. That's a very good point.
So there's a lot about you know, speaking together and so on. And I think part of it, and I'm curious about the link that Emma sent earlier about attributing carbon to cloud, because you know, you can only have consumer awareness if you have transparency throughout the supply chain. And in today's business, the data centers are pretty much at the beginning of the food chain of any supply chain, right? And throughout the chain. And I think more and more consumers are asking for transparency. My colleagues who work in the telecommunication networks area are conducting a study on, you know, how would consumers change their mobile contracts decision should they know the greenhouse gas emissions associated with their respective mobile operators. And I think we're getting through that. We're getting to that throughout the economy and the areas. More and more clients are not consumers are not satisfied anymore with knowing how much CO2 per kilometer the car will emit, but as well how much it took to produce the car beforehand. And I think I see when I speak to we happen to speak quite a bit to the telcos, to the banking sector, because they have a special relationship with cloud service providers. And they're all increasingly looking into awareness and transparency. And once again, we're getting to standards and metrics and how this is informed. But you know, the headlines of some reports that you must be aware of that say, you know, Netflixing is the new flying and things like this. I think we'll get consumers, hopefully in a peaceful manner, but in an informed manner, to require this. And the day, you know, Netflix starts asking its content delivery networks providers, and they turn to the cloud providers, and they turn to the data centers, and they will seek for an answer. And I don't know. I've got no sense of speed, but I sense it could go very quick when you see how pre-COVID a whole country like Sweden changed behavior on flying simply because of what they call themselves the shame of flying. Because of the greenhouse gases, so they've got a complicated Scandinavian word for that. But I wouldn't be surprised if we get there, knowing that in the end, you know, it's not Netflix streaming a movie home might be greenhouse gas producing, but not that long ago. A big online game software company was telling me, well, of course, streaming games consumes energy, but it still consumes less than going to theater when you take into account the car, the driving, the parking, the cooling of the theater, and things like this. And so, you know, I think we'll get there, and probably faster than we all feel.
Yeah,
that's very positive.
So I think, you know, as a panel, we seem to be agreed that, you know, you can't just look at energy efficiency from a very, you know, silo perspective. It needs to be more holistic, you know, for many reasons. Not, you know, as you said, Manuel, about the, you know, the embedded carbon of the production of IT equipment through to the disposal. You know, the software layers, the hardware layers, the infrastructural layers. You know, there's to some respects, a lot of people now are starting to focus in on this kind of circular economy of green IT. Emma, what's your feeling about this?
The circular economy, it applied to data centers, and actually I'm involved in a project, a Siddharthi project, which is actually looking at that. Some really interesting stuff is coming out of that. So it's very complicated. It's particularly complicated because different bits of the sector, I know, I was hoping you wouldn't ask me that. Different bits of the sector have very different life cycle impacts, and it depends where data centers are. So if you look at a wholesale co-location provider, it's basically the infrastructure into which everyone else puts their servers. So they will have an embedded energy impact, as mentioned before, and they will have an operational impact. And depending on which country they're in, the life cycle balance between embedded and operational can vary dramatically. Some very good work done by Beth from OI on this. I think it's her PhD study actually, but really good work on that. So there's some good stuff out there. And then you've got, say, an enterprise provider that's going to have, you know, tens of thousands of servers, or certainly thousands of servers in there, and that is a totally different, because then you've got a whole load of we that you've got to deal with at the end of life. So they're massively different. And then obviously people completely disagree on the point at which it's appropriate to replace a server. So it's very, very broad, you know, very broad spectrum of opinion on that. So some people want to make that as short as possible in terms of energy. But actually, if you look at the broader sustainability impacts of that server in terms of materials, sourcing, and everything else, then actually a very, very short lifetime may not be so good. And then it, of course, depends on which bits of the server you're going to replace. Is it the whole thing? Or what are you going to do with it? You know, I mean, it is incredibly complex. So in terms of basic steps for circularity, one of the things I'm helping the project with is to try and identify what would be good, you know, essentially good actions for the sector on that. And as we're only halfway through the project, I don't know what they are yet, to be honest. But there are some obvious things. And again, it's greater transparency about impact. It's about what you do with those servers later, as we talked about, you know, shredding disks as opposed to reusing product. Do you want to keep reusing, you know, lots of old servers? Because actually the whole point of getting rid of them was to reduce the energy impact. So that, you know, it's about so many levels, so many layers, so many different types of equipment, so many different types of business model. I haven't answered the question at all, I know, but
well, it was interesting anyway. Mark, I mean, you know, from standards development perspective, you know, you've got to be kind of siloed, otherwise you'd never write the things, would you? You know, you'd never complete them. So how do we solve this?
Well, I think there's two things on that, Steve. So firstly, you've got to, as with any problem, you've got to set some sort of boundary conditions. Otherwise, the problem just becomes too you know, insurmountable. So you've got to limit yourself to those areas which you know, are possible to focus on and get a result. I think the more important thing about standards in our sector, though, is not about what's lacking or the work that's been done. It's about actually recognizing that there are standards. And what I mean by that is there's lots and lots of things out there that effectively compete. There are proprietary claims to standards. There are national standards, and there are international standards. The international standards are actually all relatively new, and there are a lot of people around the world, in our sector, who just do not understand them or don't even know that they exist. And I think one of the problems of our sector is that we have lots and lots of standards. We almost have too many, but not all of them are actually standards, and not all of them are relevant, across the globe. So historically, we tend to have used US standards and called them the standards. So, just to put a few names out there, but we've sort of used things like TIA 942, and we've used BICSI, and we've used Uptime Institute. All of those are very, very US based. Not all of them are standards, and those that are standards are US only standards. And by the way, there are two. So which is the US standard? And so we're very confused about what we use and what we adopt. And the very beauty of standards is that it gives us a common benchmark and a common reference point, which actually we don't have because we use different things. So my sort of plea is to, let's get behind one set of standards which are internationally recognized. So we're all talking the same language. We all measure the metrics that have been standardized, like PUE, in the same way and report in the same way. And I hate to use PUE. One day I'm going to sit on a panel where I don't mention PUE. It's going to happen one day. But let's use REF, for instance, renewable energy factor. So REF is part of the same standard series as PUE. It's part of the ISO IEC 30134 series. REF, we talked about renewable energy, green energy, sustainable energy. We've actually got a KPI and a metric for it, and nobody uses. So, let's get behind it. Let's use it. We talk about energy reuse or heat reuse. That's ERF, energy reuse factor. Again, another metric within the 30134 series. There's carbon, there's water, there's even a couple of IT metrics, surprisingly. But again, nobody knows about these things. We're not using them. Instead we go off and sort of compete around the standards arena. So again, my plea is to let's use what's available and internationally recognized and documented, and let's all talk the same language. Please.
Yeah, and I think if we had a data center provider on this panel, we'd be asking them, why is it that they can use the standard definition, the ISO standard definition of PUE when reporting back to a regulatory body, for instance. But then when you look in their marketing literature, they've got a completely different number. And when I've seen it from an operational perspective, it's different again.
I'll leave you to answer that question, Steve. There's this fog around whether things are actually truly sustainable or environmentally friendly. It's whether renewable energy is really all that it's being sold as. And one of our esteemed colleagues in the industry talks a lot about when you're buying green energy from the utilities, are you actually buying green energy, or are you just robbing it from somebody else? Because there's not enough actually out there to cope with demand. So it's a kind of bit of Peter, Bob and Paul.
I can probably help you on that. And just to bear in mind, there's a question about planning and heat networks and circular economy in the chat. So I can pick that up because I do some stuff on that. So in the UK, no, because the amount, if you want to buy certified renewable power, which and over 80% of the UK's data centre sector, over 80% of the power consumed by the UK's commercial sector is certified green. That's okay because we're still below the threshold. We're not the amount of green power available has not all been taken up. But in theory, yes, what you're doing by buying green power is you are essentially taking up existing supply. Now that may be because that's the only thing that you can do at the moment. And actually, if you don't control the electricity bill, you may not even be able to do that. You might have to do it through offsetting. So we see it being a spectrum of things you can do. At the bottom of that spectrum, yes, if you can't do anything else, if you don't control the bill, you can offset. If you pay the bill, but you aren't in a position to self-generate or engage in a PPA, you can buy certified renewable. And a lot of the big operators are looking at this, particularly the large CSPs, cloud service providers, like Google in particular, Microsoft. They're investing in power purchase agreements, whereby they are essentially funding additional utility scale renewable generation. And there's pros and cons with PPAs. Some are on site, some are virtual, so some come through the grid, and then people say, well, hang on a minute, the stuff you're really using is this, and so there's all kinds of arguments with that. But until, it's not practical to start putting a big renewable facility in the middle of Docklands. There's no land in many of the places where existing data centers are, so you'll have to do virtual. Then there's opportunities to site data centers, for instance, next to renewable power like energy from waste, or on a larger scale. As you know, a lot of the large CSPs are citing data centers in Scandinavia for services like loading videos of yourself teaching your dog to tap dance that don't need very low latency. So I don't think we're going to notice whether that comes back in 8 milliseconds or not, are we? So there's those, and then there's what we'd like to see with the sector, and I'll put a link to our data center energy route map in. We want to see the sector becoming more of a prosumer. When we have an effective supply chain and market for hydrogen, data centers, because of the way they use power, ought to be ideal prosumers within the energy landscape. But there are a number of sort of technical and market barriers for us to come across before that can happen. So I see it as more of a spectrum. Yes, we do what we can, and I'm fairly pushy in encouraging the operators not only to adopt renewables at whatever level they can, but also to set themselves commitments. And we do also have now the science-based target pathway for data center operators, and we'll be seeing how we can implement that practically for the operators over the next, I suspect, 18 months to try and get as many as possible signed up to that.
So, Manuel, is regulation always the answer, or is what could the EC do from a kind of tax perspective, or can they do nothing?
I think there's in what we were discussing a moment ago. I think there's 2-3 things that are really on top of our current thinking. The first one is about the waste heat and its recovery, and this is an area that my colleagues in dealing with energy are considering integrating in the review of the Energy Efficiency Directive. I was right now looking for to pay scheduling, because there's a public consultation ongoing, and there's questions about it. So that I think is highly relevant for what we are talking about right now. The other part where I think there's an initiative, something moving forward as well, is an initiative on the circular economy of the machines. And I'm saying this because when you look at the recovery of electronic waste, you have today about, I think the latest industry figure is about 37% of the electronic waste is properly disposed and goes through the proper channel, as opposed to going just to the grey normal garbage and to landfill without a proper recycling. And 37%, I'm no specialist about that, and maybe my colleagues dealing with this would be angry with me, but one feels that for legislation that has been out there for quite some time, this is not very satisfactory. And my feeling here, looking at it from a data center point of view, is that the data centers are the ones who should be at 100% there. I don't know if it's the case. We have an ongoing study to look into this. But there's no reason that a large consumer of electronics is not perfectly disposing of it when it does come to the real end life cycle, the real end of its life cycle. On the other end, I guess without asking you the question, but ask your friends and relatives, how many of us have got a couple of old mobile phones laying down in a shelf at home, or an old TV in the cellar, or things like this. in my street alone, there's at least a wasted TV in the street every week. I mean, it's like this, and I think there is a bit of, back to Emma's words at the beginning, there's a bit of a market failure there. People are simply not properly returning their electronic waste, and I think the low-hanging fruit there is, well, making sure the big guys are compliant, and data centers are the big guys. And I'm not sure, we're studying this, but I hope the results will be, there's 98, 99% of proper disposal. But I think the real regulatory low-hanging fruit there is in the consumer market.
It's interesting. So, if we go back, Emma, to your circular economy planning.
Yeah, I'm a bit worried. I'm going to be talking from the UK perspective rather than Irish perspective, where data centers are considered to be more planning at the planning level, can be considered to be more infrastructural. And UK, what we've seen is that data centers aren't actually mentioned in any of the strategy documents, the UK government, not the industrial strategy, not the digital strategy. The National Infrastructure Commission doesn't mention data centers, and the National Planning Policy Framework doesn't mention them. So we're kind of suggesting that data centers are explicitly included in future planning policy frameworks as part of our digital infrastructure, along with communications, and also that perhaps we might have a discussion on what kind of land use class they might be. So that's, and I know that differs between us and Ireland. When we come to heat reuse, it's one of the favourite kind of red herrings that our planners add to a data centre. So you must be obliged to provide heat to site edge. Now, the operations can do that. They can do that, but that always depends on there being a heat network and a customer. So we had one very large operator about, I think, 12 years ago, was obliged by the local authority to provide heat to waste of site. They provided heat to waste of site. When the adjacent site was redeveloped by the local authority through a contractor, they forgot to tell the contractor there was a source of waste heat, and it is still there, unconnected to what went in. So it needs a lot of joined up thinking to make these things work. And if maybe you might be able to grow tomatoes and stuff next to the data center, but it's a chain that involves many people, and when a link breaks, doesn't work. So we get quite frustrated with the planners asking for this when they don't actually know what a heat network is. So also, of course, it's waste heat is warm air, which is not that useful. If we move and it becomes, if we see immersive cooling becoming more common in the sector, then you might end up with a more useful, highly concentrated waste heat product that then would have wider applicability. And that could be a game changer, but I don't know much about it. I dare say Mr. Acton, CN, will probably know a lot more about that than me. But it would, it certainly changes the nature of the end product, I suspect, and that may change the dialogue.
There was a fascinating presentation last year at Data Centers Ireland where the lady was talking about one of the heat recovery prototype was being taken place in. I guess it's probably well advanced now, but that seems to be something which is gaining in popularity, although. It's only just recently started in Ireland. I notice that Dublin's also starting to do that now as well. What do we have to help us here? What's the sector doing about this? What are the standards, regulations? Is there anything that helps us to make more use of the reuse of heat?
No, there isn't really, Steve. I mean, yeah, I don't know if you can hear me, but
isn't there, Mark? There's a metric for heat reuse factor. Isn't there a heat reuse factor?
Yeah. Yes, there is. Yeah, I forget the number of it offhand, but the ERF, energy reuse factor. So again, it's part of the 3134 series. I think it's something like 3134-5 off the top of my head, but I could be wrong on that. But it's there. It's defined and it's reportable, and so yes, it's there. But does that help us do it? Not really. It just helps us measure it if we do it. So the challenge with actually heat recovery is it's not free. The idea that we've got this free heat lying around that somebody can use is not really true, because, to make the heat useful, to Emma's point, even with immersion cooling, there's probably going to have to be some form of heat pump to raise the temperature of that medium, and it would have to be fluid rather than air. It's a working temperature, and then we've got to find a customer for it. And the challenge with the heat is you can't move it very far before it becomes essentially fairly useless. So you can't do a lot with it unless you're plugging it into by all means a heat distribution network, or using it to grow tomatoes, or heat a swimming pool, or my favorite is actually a brewery. Put a brewery next door and use it to dry the malt and warm the water up to make beer. That's my personal favorite. So if it's looking for planning, go and find yourself a data center and plug in next to it. I'm sure it'll be a win-win situation. Those of us in data centers, we do like beer, so we'll help you consume it as well. So no, I don't think there's anything out there. I think the biggest advantage, frankly, would be something Emma alluded to, which is making planning easier. Making the process to put basically the supplier and customer in this context together. Allow that little ecosystem to develop and allow people to take advantage of those resources, which again, they're not free. I think we have to remember that it does cost money to export that heat, and let's remember that it's not free in the sense of free to do. There is capital investment required. So planning, and there we go.
So Manuel, is that a consideration in the Commission at the moment?
Yeah, I think those are all points that are very much under consideration, and how much you tailor the norms to whether you're building a fresh, brand new data center against retrofitting something for which a data center was not conceived for. That's obviously a big determining factor in this waste heat recovery question.
Okay. Have we got anything in the chat?
Is there any specific questions, Steve?
No, nothing come through. Is there anything? So what's Mark, in terms of kind of standards? What's coming down the line? Do you think? What should we expect to see over the next year or so?
Well, I think the biggest change is going to be finally a genuine global standard that references the infrastructure. I mean, it doesn't really address the sort of embodied carbon or embodied energy. But what we have got finally is an ISO standard, an ISO IEC standard, which talks about availability classes. It talks about the power distribution, the cooling distribution, the security, and various other elements, which will be published as again an ISO standard, which is great because it then dovetails with all the other ISO standards, such as 14,000 on energy management or 50,000 on energy efficiency. So it'll dovetail. So we've actually finally got a genuine data center standard that actually references or dovetails with other standards out there. And so I think it does away with that sort of competitive landscape that we have at the moment. And hopefully, again, we all end up talking the same language. Currently, that's what's called a technical supplement as opposed to a standard. So once that is published finally as a true and full standard, I think that will be something that people start to engage with. So I think it will actually change our industry somewhat.
Yeah, can't wait.
It's a big one for me.
Well, I think Hugh's appearance
that was said with passion and feeling.
Hugh's appearance suggests that we are approaching the end of this particular panel session. I'd like to thank my fellow panelists for your insight, your wit, and the very interesting information you've given us today. So back to you, I guess, Hugh.
Well, thank you very much, Steve, and thank you all for a very interesting and wide-ranging discussion. What I can say is that throughout this week and throughout this virtual festival, we have addressed a number of those subjects in depth, in detail. You're quite right. Ireland has a unique area, a unique issue and opportunity, particularly linked with renewables and the adoption of hydrogen and those things. And throughout this week, there's been some excellent content, which is all available on demand or through Data Centers Ireland, datacenters-ireland.com. But today, I found that fascinating. I have to say I understood about 1/10 of it. And I'm sorry I raised that one about planning and heat networks. I just threw it in there. It's just wanted to put a bombshell in. So
that was you, was it, Hugh?
Really, I'd just like to say thank you. If anyone's got a closing remark, say it now. If not, we shall log off and let you all get on.
Just to say here from Brussels that it was a true pleasure. And Emma, Stephen, Mark, I think we should keep on discussing bilaterally on mutual projects or of respective projects.
Well, you can all come together at Data Centers Ireland next year.
Excellent. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Good idea.
Take care.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everybody, and good to meet you, Manuel. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Goodbye.